Respect isn't something you demand in a room like this. It's something people feel when you stop trying to prove you belong. The coffee had gone cold, untouched, a thin line of steam long faded into the still air, yet it sat perfectly centered on the edge of Evelyn Carter's desk, as if it had been placed there with intention, not habit. And for a moment, just a moment, she found herself staring at it instead of the wall of numbers glowing across her screen, her phone buzzing again somewhere to her right, relentless, insistent, but she didn't reach for it, because something about that cup felt deliberate, and she couldn't quite explain why. The office around her moved at its usual clipped pace, heels against polished floors, hushed conversations that carried urgency without ever rising into chaos, the quiet hum of a company that never really slept. But inside her office, there was a pause, a fracture in the rhythm, subtle enough that no one else would notice, but strong enough to pull her attention away from everything that was supposed to matter more. She leaned back slightly, just an inch, just enough to change the angle, to see the reflection in the dark surface of the coffee, and for a second it wasn't the drink she saw. It was the memory, sharp and unwelcome. Stay in your place. The words had come out faster than she intended, edged with the kind of precision that cut without needing volume. And the room had gone still in that way rooms do when something has shifted, but no one is willing to acknowledge it out loud. She hadn't looked at him when she said it. Not really. Just a glance, quick, dismissive, efficient. He wasn't supposed to be part of that conversation. He wasn't supposed to speak. He had nodded. That was the part she remembered most clearly. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just a small, steady nod, like he had accepted something far bigger than the moment itself. And then he had stepped back into silence so seamlessly that the meeting continued as if nothing had happened at all. That should have been the end of it. In rooms like hers, moments like that dissolved quickly, buried under deadlines and decisions, and the constant forward motion of people who didn't have time to look back. But this hadn't dissolved. It lingered, not loudly, not disruptively, but persistently, like a note played too softly to hear and yet impossible to forget. Her eyes shifted again to the coffee. No assistant had come in. No notification had been sent. No knock at the door. Just there. Placed. Considered. Quiet. And somehow, that made it harder to ignore. Evelyn exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, and reached forward at last, her fingers brushing against the side of the cup, finding warmth that hadn't completely disappeared yet. And as she did, something in the back of her mind aligned. A detail, small but precise. The way he had stood earlier, not rigid, not uncertain, just present, as if he understood the room without needing to claim space inside it. And for the first time that morning, the numbers on her screen felt distant, less immediate than. The question forming beneath the surface of her thoughts. Who places something so quietly and still manages to be seen? The hallway outside Evelyn Carter's office never slowed down. Not really. But there were layers to its movement, rhythms within rhythms, and if someone stood still long enough they would notice who rushed and who did not, who spoke loudly to be heard and who did not need to raise their voice at all. And Marcus Reed moved through it without disturbing any of it, like he understood the pace but refused to be pulled by it, one hand steady on the strap of the worn backpack resting against his shoulder, the faint jingle of a small metal keychain marking his steps in a way that was almost too soft to register unless you were listening for something quiet. He did not look toward the executive offices as he passed, did not slow, did not check his reflection in the glass walls like others did. He simply continued, stopping briefly to straighten a chair that had been left half out of place, aligning it with the table with a small, precise movement that no one acknowledged and no one thanked him for. And then he moved on. In a conference room down the hall, a group of junior analysts hovered around a screen filled with numbers that refused to cooperate, their voices low but tight, frustration creeping in at the edges, one of them tapping a pen against the table just a little too fast, just a little too hard, and Marcus paused at the doorway for a fraction of a second, not intruding, not announcing himself, just observing the shape of the problem the way someone might look at a locked door and understand the mechanism without touching the handle. He stepped inside only when the pen tapping stopped, as if that was the permission he needed, and reached for a stack of printouts left slightly askew near the edge of the table, straightening them first. Always the smallest things first. then sliding one sheet gently closer to the analyst who had been staring at the screen the longest, his finger resting lightly on a single line, not pressing, not pointing with urgency, just indicating. And when the analyst followed that line and exhaled, a quiet shift passing through his shoulders, Marcus had already stepped back, already letting the moment belong to someone else. No one asked him to stay. No one asked him how he saw it. The solution began to form anyway, voices picking up, energy returning, and within seconds the room no longer needed him, which seemed to be exactly how he preferred it. Back in her office, Evelyn stood now instead of sitting, the coffee still in her hand, the warmth fading but not gone, her gaze drifting past the glass wall just in time to catch that same subtle movement in the hallway, the straightening of a chair, the absence of hesitation, and something about the familiarity of it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately categorize, because it did not demand attention and yet it held it. It did not ask for recognition and yet it remained visible. And for the first time in a long time, she realized she had missed something not because it was hidden, but because it had never tried to be seen at all. By mid-morning the building had settled into that deceptive rhythm where everything appeared under control while small fractures quietly spread beneath the surface. And in conference room B the numbers had begun to resist again, not dramatically, not in a way that triggered alarms, but in subtle misalignments that forced people to double-check what should have been certain, voices lowering as confidence thinned, screens refreshing more often than necessary, as if clarity might arrive through repetition alone. And Evelyn stood at the head of the table now, arms relaxed but posture precise, listening without interrupting, which in her world was often more unsettling than speaking, because silence from her did not mean patience, it meant expectation. Someone offered a projection that did not quite hold. Another suggested a revision that only shifted the uncertainty somewhere else. The room tightened, inch by inch, until even the air seemed to wait for a decision that no one was ready to make. At the far end, unnoticed at first, Marcus had entered quietly, not through the main door, but from the side corridor that most people forgot existed, carrying a small stack of folders that he set down near the wall, not at the table, never at the table, his presence aligned with function rather than authority, and yet his eyes moved across the screen with the same steady attention he gave to everything else, not rushing, not scanning, just taking it in piece by piece as if time behaved differently for him. A chair near the corner sat slightly angled, left that way by someone who had stood up too quickly, and he adjusted it without thinking. The soft scrape against the floor almost lost beneath the low hum of conversation, but the movement created a brief pause, just enough for one of the analysts to lose his train of thought, just enough for silence to slip in again. Evelyn's gaze shifted, not directly, not fully, but enough to register him there, still, composed, already fading back into the background the way he always did, and yet the memory from earlier pressed forward again, not loud, not insistent, just present, like something unfinished. The discussion resumed, but it had lost its direction, circling instead of advancing, each suggestion adding weight without resolution, and Marcus remained where he was, not stepping forward, not offering anything uninvited, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the folder stack, fingers still, as if waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. Then one of the analysts, younger than the rest, hesitated mid-sentence, her voice trailing off as she looked at the data again, uncertainty clear but unspoken, and for a brief second her eyes lifted, not toward Evelyn, not toward the screen, but toward the room itself, searching without knowing for what, and that was when Marcus moved, just one step closer, not enough to claim space, only enough to be within reach, sliding a single sheet from the top of the stack and placing it gently near her hand, not interrupting, not drawing attention, just aligning the page so that one column met her line of sight, his finger hovering above it without touching, and then withdrawing before anyone could fully register the gesture. The analyst blinked, followed the line, and something shifted, small but real, her shoulders easing as the pattern revealed itself. Not new information, just seen differently, and she spoke again, this time with clarity that carried across the table, connecting the scattered points into something usable, something stable. The room adjusted around her, energy returning, direction forming, and Evelyn watched it happen without speaking, her eyes moving from the screen to the page to the man who had already stepped back into stillness, his role complete before it had ever been acknowledged. And in that quiet alignment of details, she began to understand that influence did not always arrive with permission, and control did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. The momentum in the room did not return all at once. It rebuilt itself in layers, voices finding their footing again, numbers aligning with intention instead of resistance. And for a while it seemed as if the disruption had never existed at all, as if clarity had simply arrived on its own. But Evelyn knew better. She had seen the exact moment it shifted, had traced it not to the data but to the quiet adjustment that no one had named. And now that she had noticed it, she could not unsee it. The way Marcus Reed moved not toward attention but toward necessity, filling gaps before anyone else acknowledged they were there. She let the conversation continue without stepping in, allowing the team to carry the solution forward, her gaze no longer fixed on the presentation but drifting, measuring something less visible, something harder to quantify. And when her eyes found him again, he was already at the edge of the room, gathering the same folders he had brought in, movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the pace of the room had never applied to him in the first place. There was no expectation in his posture, no glance toward her for approval or recognition, only a quiet completion of task. And then he turned slightly, preparing to leave in the same unobtrusive way he had entered. Marcus. The name left her before she had fully decided to say it, not loud, not sharp, but enough to interrupt the space between movement and exit, and the room stilled just enough for it to register. He paused, not abruptly, just a natural stop, turning back with a calm that did not mirror the tension others might have felt in that moment. His expression steady, attentive without being guarded. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since earlier, and for a brief second the memory of her own words hovered between them, unspoken but present, and yet he did not react to it, did not hold it, did not offer it back. Leave those, she said, gesturing lightly toward the folders, though they were already set where they needed to be, the instruction unnecessary, almost incidental, but it gave her a reason to hold him there a moment longer. He nodded once, the same small, grounded motion as before, and stepped away from the stack without question. The room waited, not for him, but for her, for whatever would come next, but she did not continue speaking, not immediately, because what she was noticing did not fit into the language she usually used in this space. It was not about performance or hierarchy or efficiency. It was something quieter, something that existed underneath all of that. Marcus did not shift his weight, did not fill the silence. He simply stood there, present, giving the moment room instead of trying to resolve it. And in that stillness, she felt something unfamiliar, not loss of control, but the absence of the need to assert it. That adjustment, she said finally, her voice even, her eyes meeting his fully now, the one you made. She did not finish the sentence, did not turn it into a question, but the meaning carried anyway. He glanced briefly toward the screen, then back to her, not claiming ownership, not deflecting either, just acknowledging the reference with a quiet clarity. It was already there, he said, his tone level, almost gentle. They just needed a different angle to see it. No emphasis, no explanation beyond what was necessary, and then he fell silent again, leaving the words where they were without building on them. The simplicity of it settled into the room more deeply than any extended analysis could have, and Evelyn held his gaze a second longer than she intended, recognizing in that answer something she had overlooked, not just in the data, but in the way she had been leading, the way she had been looking at people, at roles, at place. Understood, she said at last, a single word, but it carried a different weight now, not directive, not dismissive, something closer to acknowledgement. Marcus gave the smallest nod again and turned, continuing toward the door, his presence already receding without resistance. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the faint sound of that small keychain followed him, barely audible, but distinct enough that this time, Evelyn noticed exactly when it disappeared. The meeting ended without ceremony, chairs sliding back into place, voices lowering into smaller conversations as people gathered their notes and devices, the urgency dissolving into movement. But something had shifted beneath it all, something that did not announce itself, and yet remained present in the way people glanced, in the way they hesitated just a fraction longer before speaking, as if recalibrating what mattered and who they had overlooked. Evelyn stayed behind, not out of necessity but out of choice, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, the screen now dimmed, its numbers no longer demanding her attention, and for the first time that day the room felt larger, quieter, less controlled. She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting to the chair near the corner, the one that had been slightly out of place earlier, now perfectly aligned again, and she wondered not for the first time how many things had been quietly corrected before she ever noticed they were wrong. Outside in the hallway, Marcus moved with the same steady rhythm, the building unfolding around him in familiar patterns, his focus shifting from one small detail to the next, a loose stack of papers on a reception desk, a door not fully closed, a trash bin filled just past its limit, none of it urgent, none of it dramatic, but each thing addressed with the same care, the same consistency, as if the act of maintaining order was not a task, but a principle. When he reached the service corridor, the noise softened, replaced by a more muted hum, and he set his backpack down briefly against the wall, unzipping it just enough to check inside, his hand pausing on a small lunch container wrapped carefully in a cloth, his expression unchanged but his touch more deliberate, more grounded, as if that simple object carried a different weight than anything else he handled that day. He closed the bag again and lifted it over his shoulder, the faint jingle of the keychain returning, marking his steps as he continued. Back in her office, Evelyn finally sat down, the cup of coffee now empty, though she did not remember finishing it, her fingers still resting against its side, as if holding on to something that had already passed. Her phone buzzed again, insistent, pulling her back toward the pace she knew so well, but she did not reach for it immediately, her mind still tracing the conversation, the adjustment, the words that had followed, simple and unclaimed. It was already there. They just needed a different angle to see it. The statement echoed differently now, no longer about the numbers, no longer about the meeting, but about something broader, something that unsettled the structure she had relied on for years, the idea that value did not always rise through visibility, that presence did not need to demand recognition to be real. She leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting toward the glass wall again, watching the movement beyond it, the constant flow of people who believed they understood the hierarchy they were moving within, and for the first time, she questioned how much of that structure was built on assumption rather than truth. Somewhere in that flow, Marcus passed again, just a brief silhouette through the glass, his pace unchanged, his attention fixed on something ahead that no one else had noticed yet, and this time, Evelyn did not look away too quickly, her focus holding just long enough to recognize that what she had dismissed earlier as position was in fact something else entirely, something quieter, steadier, and far more difficult to define. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting long, linear shadows across the polished floor and the walls of glass that separated Evelyn Carter from the rest of the building, a quiet reminder of structure and order even as the day unraveled in ways she had not anticipated, and she remained standing by the window, watching movement beyond the panes, noting how people passed with purpose but missed the subtle markers of the day, small adjustments that went unnoticed, corrections, without recognition, and she thought of Marcus Reed, moving through the space earlier with his quiet diligence, the way he aligned chairs, straightened papers, and corrected minor disruptions without a single word, as if the room itself followed his rhythm even when it did not consciously register it. She set down the empty coffee cup, fingertips lingering briefly on its smooth surface, tracing the outline absent-mindedly, and considered how presence could carry weight without announcement, how influence could exist without speech, and she realized she had been measuring productivity and leadership in volume and visibility, overlooking the deeper measure of impact that moved silently, like a current beneath a still pond. Across the hall, she caught a glimpse of him again, passing a doorway with deliberate steps, attention focused on details no one else noticed, and it struck her how the simplest acts could redirect energy in a room, how patience and precision could carry far more authority than insistence or volume. The elevator doors opened nearby, releasing a pair of colleagues who hurried past, papers clutched, phones in hand, and Evelyn remained still, absorbing the contrast between their movement and his, the difference between being seen and truly affecting the environment. She recalled the brief interactions earlier, how a folder placed correctly, a chair adjusted slightly, a single sheet of data aligned differently, had reshaped the flow of the room without anyone conscious of it, and she marveled at the subtlety, at the power inherent in observation and timing, in knowing when to act and when to wait. The hum of the building softened as the day edged toward evening, the constant pulse of activity slowing just enough for unnoticed gestures to become visible, and Evelyn leaned slightly on the window ledge, considering her own approach, the way she might incorporate a steadiness she had dismissed as mundane, and the realization settled like a quiet weight. Control and respect were not given by decree or assertion. They were recognized in the way one carried themselves, in the attentiveness one paid to the environment and the people within it, and Marcus had demonstrated it without seeking acknowledgement. She breathed deeply, letting the sunlight warm her shoulders for the last few minutes of the day, and watched him disappear around a corner, the faint sound of the keychain marking his steps lingering in her awareness, a reminder that small, consistent actions could shift perspective more effectively than any speech or display. And in that quiet recognition, Evelyn felt a subtle shift in her own understanding of leadership, of presence, and of the power inherent in calm, deliberate attention to what others overlooked. Evening light crept deeper into the office, elongating shadows and softening the hard edges of the glass walls, turning the space from a domain of precision into a room of reflection, and Evelyn Carter remained at her desk, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, as she reviewed the final notes from the day, not needing to respond immediately to the flood of emails waiting in her inbox because the weight of the afternoon had shifted something imperceptible yet undeniable in her perception. The meeting had ended, but the effects lingered, a subtle reordering of awareness that was difficult to articulate, like the difference between noticing a song for the first time and understanding its melody years later. She traced her gaze across the room, noting the alignment of chairs, the small movements that had passed unnoticed, and her mind returned again to Marcus Reed, moving through that space with an almost imperceptible authority, influencing without declaration, adjusting without drawing attention, acting in ways that reshaped the environment without asking permission or recognition. She allowed herself a slow breath, a rare pause in a day that usually demanded constant motion, considering the way his presence had filtered through the room, the sequence of small, precise acts that had altered the outcome without ever seeming intentional, and she realized she had witnessed a form of leadership entirely different from her own, one built on attention, patience, and subtle intervention rather than directives or authority. Outside, the hallway had emptied gradually, the hum of conversation fading, the distant click of heels echoing briefly before dissolving into silence, and she imagined him navigating it, each step measured, each interaction purposeful but understated, a rhythm invisible to anyone not attuned to the quieter currents of the day. She rose from her chair, moving to the window again, placing her hands lightly on the sill, feeling the residual warmth from the sunlight fading slowly as the sky shifted into deeper hues, and in that stillness she reflected on her own expectations of control and recognition, the way she had always equated influence with volume, speed, and visibility, realizing that Marcus had shown another way entirely, one that operated beneath notice yet carried real impact. Her phone lay on the desk, its buzzing momentarily paused in the quiet, and she did not reach for it, allowing herself to exist in the awareness of subtlety, the understanding that guidance and effectiveness could exist without declaration, that presence and care could quietly redirect outcomes in ways louder voices often could not. She exhaled, feeling the tension of the day lift just slightly, noticing for the first time the way the soft hum of the ventilation, the faint shifting of papers, and the diminishing footsteps in the hall combined into a pattern that mirrored his own calm consistency. And in that recognition, she felt an unexpected clarity, a quiet understanding that patience, attentiveness, and subtle action held more power than she had realized. And as the office descended fully into evening, the space no longer simply a workplace but a canvas for unseen influence, Evelyn carried forward that lesson, conscious now of the way small, deliberate acts could shift the perception and effectiveness of an entire room, without anyone demanding acknowledgement or applause, the echo of his careful, deliberate rhythm remaining long after he had gone. The office was quieter now, the sun having fully set beyond the skyline, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights that reflected off polished surfaces and the glass walls enclosing it. And Evelyn Carter remained standing by her desk, eyes tracing the contours of the space she had moved through countless times, yet now perceived differently, noticing how the alignment of furniture, the subtle positioning of documents, and the residual echoes of human presence combined to create an order she had not fully appreciated before. Marcus Reed had already left the main floor, his figure disappearing into the corridor that led to the service stairwell, and yet his presence lingered in the form of small, precise adjustments he had made, the kind of gestures unnoticed by anyone except those attuned to the subtle currents of a room, and Evelyn found herself reflecting on them, considering how each act, so quiet and deliberate, had influenced the energy of the team, the flow of the work, and even her own perception of control. She walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the hallway, observing the ebb and flow of movement, the muted conversations of late departures, and the careful, measured steps of people unaware of the shifts occurring around them, and she recognized that the difference between mere occupancy and meaningful presence could be as slight as a nudge of a chair, a gently placed sheet of paper, or the patient waiting for the right moment to act, all of which Marcus had demonstrated without drawing attention to himself or seeking recognition. A soft hum from the ventilation mixed with the faint click of a keyboard from a nearby office, the sounds forming a rhythm that underlined the calm that now filled the room, and Evelyn leaned against the sill, hands lightly touching the cool surface, thinking about the lessons embedded in these moments, the understanding that influence did not always manifest in bold declarations or overt control, but in steadiness, attentiveness, and timing, which often went unnoticed by the unobservant eye. She recalled the earlier interactions, the subtle redirection of energy in the conference room, the way the flow of conversation had realigned without a single forceful command, and she realized that leadership could be most effective when it was least obvious, when it allowed others to feel empowered while quietly guiding outcomes, a principle Marcus embodied with natural consistency. Her mind traced the sequence of the afternoon once more, from the adjustment of chairs and papers to the gentle placement of a folder, to the calm acknowledgement of a team member's hesitation, and she noted the transformation of the space that resulted, not because of authority or instruction, but because of deliberate, unobtrusive presence. She allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the subtle weight of understanding settle, the room now quiet and ordered in ways that spoke more profoundly than any directive could, and in that stillness she appreciated the invisible threads connecting action, awareness, and outcome, recognizing that quiet influence could be far more potent than volume. And as she finally sat down at her desk, the glow of the city beyond casting long reflections across her workspace, she held that understanding. The gentle power of deliberate attention lingering like a presence in the room, even when the actor himself had departed. The office had emptied almost completely now, the quiet settling over the space like a soft blanket, and Evelyn Carter remained at her desk, fingers lightly resting on the smooth surface, absorbing the stillness and the subtle transformation that had taken place over the course of the day, a change imperceptible to anyone else but profound. To her own perception, the cumulative effect of small gestures and precise timing that had shifted the atmosphere without fanfare or announcement, leaving a sense of balance that spoke more powerfully than any directive could. She reflected on the presence of Marcus Reed, moving through the building with measured steps, attending to details no one else noticed, each movement deliberate, purposeful, and yet without drawing attention, and she realized that influence did not require assertion, that leadership was not always loud, and that quiet consistency could reshape not just a room but a mindset, the people within it, and even the one observing. The city lights beyond the window reflected off the polished floor and the glass walls, stretching thin lines of illumination that traced across the office in patterns reminiscent of the paths Marcus had walked, unnoticed yet precise, each one holding a quiet significance that only became apparent when one paused to observe. Evelyn took a slow breath, allowing the realization to settle fully, The understanding that small, deliberate acts could carry more weight than visible authority, that attentiveness and patience could guide outcomes with a subtlety often overlooked in the rush of a corporate day. And she felt a rare calm, a quiet confidence in knowing that the rhythm of influence could exist beneath the surface of perception, shaping results without need for acknowledgement or applause. Her gaze lingered on the empty chair near the corner, aligned now perfectly. A simple reminder of how small adjustments created order and clarity without fanfare, and she considered how this understanding might inform her own approach, the ways in which she could integrate patience, observation, and deliberate action into her leadership without sacrificing efficiency or control. Outside the window, the hum of the city continued, distant but steady, a reminder of life beyond the office, the continuous flow of people, energy, and movement, and Evelyn felt a sense of connection to that rhythm, the same rhythm Marcus had navigated all day with quiet attentiveness. She finally stood fully, straightening her posture and lifting her gaze to the remaining lights that illuminated the office, taking one last moment to absorb the order, the calm, and the subtle influence that had transformed the space and her own perspective, recognizing that the lesson was not in the dramatic, not in the command or display, but in the quiet presence, the steady hand, and the ability to shape a day, a room, and perhaps even people, with careful, unassuming action. And in that understanding she felt a soft, enduring shift in her own approach, an awareness of power that was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly human, and she allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement of that change as she finally turned toward the door, carrying the insight with her into the evening and beyond. The subtle echoes of Marcus Reed's presence remaining, unspoken, in the contours of the room and in the patterns of thought she would carry forward.